Welcome to another episode of our Practical SQL Server HA show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento and welcome. It's a beautiful Friday fall morning, although for us it's kind of weird because we are getting like 3 seasons in a day. Like in the afternoon, sometimes it's a little bit summer, and our summers, of course, our summer weather is totally different from other parts of the world, right? Now I'm doing the temperature conversion from Celsius to Fahrenheit for my American friends. We are getting around 20 plus, around 23, 24 in the afternoon to a high of 25. And that for us is summer, to a low of sometimes freezing at night. So we are getting like 3 seasons all in one day. But I cannot complain because I can still go out and enjoy the beautiful outdoors where the colors change. It's it's fun taking photos of the leaves when they're changing colors, and it's just beautiful. I grew up, was born and raised in a tropical country, so me seeing something like this, like I only saw fall colors and beautiful fall foliage on children's books when I was a kid, and movies. Right now, I get to see it in my own backyard, day in and day out. So it's like, wow, it's amazing. Anyway, welcome to this episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Today's topic is something that I personally made some mistakes in the past off of, part of the growth journey as well. They were my own mistakes. They were something that I also observed working with consultants and also being a consultant myself. And the premise of this is, let's say you are being your company or your boss made a decision. Sure, we are going to implement a high availability and disaster recovery solution, and then because your team is not ready, meaning you don't have the right expertise, you don't have the right skill set on the team, or maybe the person who knows this, maybe the senior DBA left, right, for some medical emergency, or he moved on to a different company. You needed to deploy something fast, quick, and what your boss did was to make a decision. Let's go hire either a consultant, a subject matter expert, an external party, a managed services provider to help you implement this thing called an always on availability group or any type of SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery solution, right? But again, as a consultant myself, I've made these mistakes, and also it's one of the reasons why I'm also highlighting some of these things that your consultant or your subject matter experts may not be telling you about high availability and disaster recovery solution. And it's not because they don't want to tell you. It's just that sometimes they're not aware of them. Like in my case, back then, I was not even aware of the fact that I'm actually doing these. Right? And I want to share them with you because, number one, they're more important than your HADR solutions. Right? They're more important, especially when you're bringing in somebody external. These are more important than the HADR solution in and of itself. And when you're ready, grab pen. Again, I'm old school. I like having my pen and paper, right? First one, and I did this. This was a mistake for me. I made this mistake myself, and I see a lot of consultants make this mistake as well. The first one, again, make sure that you're taking notes. Complexity is the enemy of execution. I took the quote from, I forgot who, but it is true that complexity is the enemy of execution. What do I mean by that? When you or a consultant comes in, a subject matter expert comes in and starts diagramming and creating an architecture of your high availability solution, chances are it would be complex. Not just from the point of view of the implementation, the design, and deployment, but also in the operations aspect of this. I'll give you a very simple example. 3-node failover cluster with a 3-replica AG, 2 replicas in a local data center, meaning they're in the same data center for high availability, and 1 replica for a disaster recovery site. You might be thinking, well, that's simple. It's a 3-node failover cluster with a 3-replica AG. 2 replicas for HA, 1 replica for DR. You might think that's simple, but bear with me for a second, because for one, the implementation in itself requires you interacting with your Active Directory guys, you interacting with your networking guys, you're interacting with your sysadmins. And all of this is not even considering doing your job as a SQL Server DBA, installing SQL Server, configuring SQL Server for always on available groups, replicating the database, turning on the synchronization, and then rolling it out into production, right? It is very challenging for a solution as complex as that to, number one, hand off to somebody who does not know how the entire thing works. I mean, again, you're bringing in somebody external, a consultant, subject matter expert, managed services provider, and they have no clue at all how your entire process works. Meaning, what's the escalation process? What is is there a uh, level 1 escalation team that would handle the tickets in case there's something happened? Is there another level of escalation if, let's say, it's a failure of a cluster issue? Will that be escalated to the SQL Server DBAs? Will that be escalated to the Windows sysadmins? And of course, if you're just level 1 escalation team, how do you know, right? It says SQL Server. I'm going to forward this to the SQL Server team. But in reality, though, you have to understand what the alert is, what the notification is all about, to properly escalate that to the people involved. And I'm just talking about the complexity of the entire architecture here. I'm not even talking about the operations aspect, right? You deploy, somebody comes in, and they don't talk about, excuse me, they don't talk about the whole operation. They only focus more on the deployment aspect. Sure, they've architected it, they deployed it, and it's now in production. What comes next? Well, once it's in production, your team is going to be responsible for taking care of it. Care and feeding, operational aspects, troubleshooting, triaging, all of these things need to be part of your responsibility. The thing is, external consultants, subject matter experts that you're bringing in from the outside, they would not look at this. That is your responsibility, right? Man, that was tough. The thing about this is, the more complex something is, the more you're going to have some difficulty trying to figure out how to fit that into your operational process. I'll give you another example where I myself made the same mistake. I was part of a project a couple of years ago where we were deploying an entire SharePoint farm, UAT staging production. And this is a multi-tier SharePoint farm. I was taking care of everything from the web front end to the middle tier up to the SQL Server databases. And for the DR strategy, or for the HA strategy, we had a failover clustered instance. For the DR strategy, we had either log shipping or database mirroring combined to achieve their HA plus DR plus some compliance requirements where they need to have like multiple copies of the database in addition to just meeting DR. I built the infrastructure, so I kind of know exactly what to do. The client or the customer has a team of DBAs. Not all of them have an understanding of how failover clustering works. Not to mention, of course, that they are going to be responsible for taking care of this once I hand it over to them. So the project manager asked me, okay, write down your DR process. Because for HA, well, the failover cluster is going to take care of the automatic failover, so that's fine. I wrote down the documentation, I wrote down the process, I made it as simple as I possibly can. As simple as I possibly can. But the reality is the infrastructure in itself is already complex, right? The assumption there is always make sure that you built something that you can hand over to the person responsible for taking care of it, right? Even when I was working as a data center engineer, the assumption is we are going to build it as engineers. And then the operation teams, they need to be able to take care of it. Meaning, if they get a page, they get an alert, they get notification for something, they need to be able to take care of the issue without without immediately escalating to us, right? Man, my throat is just not cooperating today. Meaning, even though I built the system, even though I have an idea of how the operational process works, the fact is, I'm an external entity. I'm not going to be the one doing the operations myself. And even if I do, well, I'm not going to be there 24/7, right? There needs to be a team responsible for taking care of this. And so when I wrote the documentation, I wrote it from my perspective with an understanding of how failover clustering works, how log shipping works, and how database mirroring works. Part of the entire project was to make sure that the failover to DR works. And so we got on with all the different members of the team, and I was responsible for the entire failing over to DR. Well and good, the documentation passed. What we didn't realize, though, was that I'm not going to be there forever. I will hand off the documentation to their operations team. And when I asked 6 months, 12 months down the road, I asked them, so when was the last time you did well, we kind of call it rehearsal. When was the last time you tested your DR strategy? I mean, I've documented everything. We've tested it. Everything's worked. When was the last time you tested the DR strategy or the DR plan with your internal team? They did not. And that's why I said complexity is the enemy of execution. When the design and the implementation itself is already complex, there's less of a chance that the people who will be taking care of it, who number one, don't even know how it works. Number two, even if they know how it works, they're not properly trained on how to work on it. Because there's a big difference between knowing how it works and knowing how to actually take care of it when something goes wrong. Because again, you can read a ton of documentation on availability groups, failover clustering, database mirroring, log shipping, all of these things. But if you've never done it before, and even if you've done it before, you've never had production experience where all the lights are going off, alerts are firing, and your email is constantly getting bombarded with these email alerts. Well, that's a totally different story than you following a documentation and doing the DR plan. Because my assumption has always been, in a real disaster, your primary responsibility is not to manage and failovers. No, in a real disaster, your primary responsibility is your own safety. Somebody else is going to be doing this for you, right? If you're stuck in the middle of a hurricane, for instance, well, you better hop onto your vehicle and drive as far away as you can from the hurricane, and let somebody else do the DR, right? They're the ones doing the failing over. And so the plan, that first off, the implementation, the design has to be as simple as you possibly can, right? As well as the DR plan should be as simple as it possibly can, because the assumption is you're not going to be there to be the one doing all of this when real disaster strikes, right? So that's the first one. Complexity is the enemy of execution. The more complex something is, the more difficult it is to implement or to execute. So you got to be careful about that. And again, if you are inviting an external consultant, a SQL Server expert that is, of course, not familiar with your internal processes, ask as much question as you can, given the understanding, and of course, we all have limited understanding, given the understanding that you have about the solution, and start looking at how you can incorporate that into your internal processes, into your operational procedures, because eventually you're going to be taking care of that, right? You are going to be responsible for making sure that it actually works. Just because it works once doesn't mean it's going to work forever, right? That's why you're there. It is your responsibility to make sure that it continues to work, right? So that's the first one. And the second was a little bit more controversial, because I was in this position back then when I was working for a managed services provider and I was the consultant. This was something that I couldn't really reconcile myself with the idea, so I just went on with it, even though I didn't really like it. The concept of billable hours. right? When you're bringing in a consultant, most of the time, it's all about the billable hours. And the way I look at this is it's a lose-lose situation. What do I mean by that? Well, you want to implement a high availability and disaster recovery solution. You may have an understanding of what you need. You bring in somebody who's done this multiple times already. They already have a background. You ask for an estimate of how long the project will take. Well, of course, they've done it a couple of times, dozens or even hundreds of times. They already have an idea of all the mishaps, of all the pitfalls, of all the things that they are not in control of, right? And so they would quote a certain number of billable hours or man hours or man days, depending on, again, the availability of internal resources plus their capabilities. But, and this is what the controversial thing is, there is no benefit to the consultant to do the work as fast as they possibly can. Let's say, on average, something as simple as a two-node failover cluster with a two-replica AG, given everything has been provided for, could be done together with the documentation and all, could be done in a total of 5 days. But there really is no benefit to the consultant to finish the work in 3, right? In 3 days, if he knows he can do it in 2. You see what I'm doing there? Because again, if you're an expert at what you do, if you're really, really good at what you do, you've done this a couple of times, you've seen, what are the glitches if I do this, what's the process going to look like. You've already built your, what I call the recipe of how to get this thing done, how to deploy an availability group, how to deploy a failover clustered instance with a combination of, let's say, log shipping, or maybe it's a distributed availability group for multiple failover clustered instances, and you've already done that in the past, so you kind of have an idea. But there is no benefit to the consultant to do the work as fast as they possibly can. Why? If you do the math, so let's say a consultant gets paid like $500 an hour. Yes, that's how much some of the external consultants are getting paid for. 500 times 8 hours, that's 4K times 5, 20K. If he finishes the work in 3 days, because he can actually do it in 2, he just made some, in engineering, we call it factor of safety. And factor of safety is, well, we don't really know exactly what's going to happen, so we're putting in some padding for the just in case, right? There's no benefit to the consultant if he finishes the work in 3 days, because in 3 days, that's 12K versus 20K in 5 days. And I hope you're getting this, because this is what almost every consultant does. When they come in, because they're getting paid by the hour, they're going to come up with a number. It's not ridiculously large, right? It's not like, yeah, we're going to throw in a bunch of hours there and we're just going to twiddle our thumbs because we're getting paid. No, it's not that. It's just that there is no benefit to the consultant to do the work fast and therefore give you an estimate that would shortchange them. So typically, it's a factor of safety. It's an insurance policy to pad in some hours for something that they have no control over, right? But like I said, it's a lose-lose situation, because the consultant does not have any incentive to finish the work fast, and your company does not have any incentive at all to keep paying the consultant if there's nothing more to do. Right? Although some people would say, okay, we're keeping him as an insurance policy, but that's totally separate, right? That's a totally separate thing, and it's not part of billable hours. The thing is, if you are going to bring in a consultant, most of the time it is all about the billable hours. They make more money. I want to say us, because I totally hate billable hours. We consultants make money based off billable hours. We're going to charge you billable hours. And so when that happens, there is no incentive for me to shorten the number of hours, even though I can do the work fast, right? And there's also no incentive for the business or the company to keep the consultant just doing nothing. So it's a lose-lose situation. And that's why you start to see a lot of consultants would include, oh, we're going to include the documentation, we're going to include this, and we're going to include that. and make you think that you're actually getting more. For me, the way I deal with this is I only focus on what is necessary at that point, right? And I kind of look at this from a point of view of working as a doctor in an emergency room. In an emergency room, when somebody is bleeding, the doctor's job is to stop that bleeding. He's not going to recommend, hey, I've got this supplement, that you can try so you can get back to being strong. No, at that point, the goal of the doctor is to stop the bleeding. And when I come in, that's the first thing that I look at. I look at, what is it that you actually need? Not, oh, you might want to throw in this specific thing, and then, as part of the estimate, I would then add more because, well, that's one way that I could increase the number of billable hours. I really don't like the idea of billable hours. I mean, we all do it. That's the reason why you work a 9 to 5 job. You get paid by the hour. And that's also one of the reasons why there is really no incentive for people to do their work fast, because, well, I'm going to get paid. And you see this almost everywhere. Go to the grocery store, go to Walmart, go to Target, and you would observe that people are actually taking their time doing their work, because, again, there's no incentive for them to especially if they're getting paid by the hour. There's no incentive for them to get the work done. And I noticed this at one point when we were doing groceries at Costco. You would see uh, multiple aisles. There's one aisle where a person would really take their time scanning the item, putting it in the bag, or on another aisle, somebody's like doing everything that they can to get a lot of stuff done, right? And this is just a byproduct of the fact that we are, by the nature of what we do, always thinking about billable hours, right? Maybe I can get overtime, so I'll probably, not hurry up and think of ways on how I can do the work as fast. So that's just a natural side effect of the whole concept of billable hours and trading time for money, right? So that's the second one. So the first one is complexity is the enemy of execution. The second thing is that concept of billable hours is not to both of the parties' advantage, right? The third thing, and this comes up whenever a new version of something is introduced. Like, for instance, we're looking forward to SQL Server 2022 within the next couple of, I don't know how long, right? And even if I do know, the NDA is not going to allow me to tell you that. But we are looking forward to the next version of SQL Server, which is 2022. And if you ask a consultant, hey, we are going to build an HA and a DR solution, right? What version are we looking at? Typically, they would recommend the latest and the greatest. And it would talk about features. Oh, this one I'm going to talk about just for the 2022 sake. Oh, contained availability groups. This new feature you can take advantage of when you want to deploy availability groups and so on and so forth, right? This is a typical strategy that consultants do. There are two reasons for this. One, they're bringing in their expertise and their experience from other customers. And that's fine because they've seen more examples, they've seen more scenarios where this version of SQL Server, let's say 2022, is already released. And they've seen multiple cases where the customer indeed has benefited from implementing the latest and the greatest version, right? The other reason why they want to do that, of course, that's great. That's to my advantage. Somebody's already tested it. Somebody's already figured it out. And this guy is telling me, sure, go ahead and do it. So that's to my advantage if I'm a customer. The other side of it is, in most cases, they just want to implement something so that they can put it on their resume. Oh, I've I've implemented something in this version, in this edition, this specific feature, and they can put it on their resume. Especially if you're a consultant, you can always talk about the latest and the greatest features that you've worked with. Having had the experience of getting early access to bits of early release of software when I was a Microsoft MVP, that's a double-edged sword in some cases where we've seen the bugs. before it goes to before it's officially released to the general public. And my goal is to look at the risks and mitigate the risks, right? And I've recommended doing the latest and the greatest to customers, but my approach has always been, what is the goal? What are we trying to accomplish? This takes me back to a client that I worked with several years ago, where when SQL Server 2017 was introduced, there, and it's interesting because top to bottom, from the developers to their infrastructure servers, they're all running Linux. The only Microsoft stuff that they have is SQL Server, Active Directory, and DNS. That's it. Uh, Most of them, the developers, are using Linux. They're using Ubuntu. And so when they heard of SQL Server 2017 supporting running on top of Linux, they asked me, hey, would you be fine? We are looking at evaluating SQL Server always on availability groups, and we want to run it on Linux. Now it's interesting. I just said sure, but I didn't just go ahead with the idea. I asked them a couple of questions just to get really clear about what it is that they really want to accomplish. Well, first they said, well, our entire team uses Linux. We have sysadmins, we have engineers, we have developers. We're a Linux shop. The only reason why we're using Microsoft is for, again, SQL Server, Active Directory, and DNS. Okay, fair enough. You can run it on Linux. Well, the second question that I needed to ask was, how many people on your team know SQL Server availability groups? Me and the other DBA. Okay, so you're thinking of implementing this as a high availability solution. You want to put it on Linux, and there's only you and the other DBA who knows about this. Okay, let's ask the third question. How many on your team knows Linux SageMaker like the back of their hands? Yeah, kind of like the reaction, because for one, it's different knowing Linux. It's different knowing Linux versus knowing what makes high availability possible for SQL Server, right? Hey, Josh, good morning. It's different from knowing Linux as an operating system. It's different from knowing the infrastructure that powers high availability on Linux. And they were like, nobody. So it doesn't make sense for them to deploy SQL Server availability groups on Linux just because they're running on Linux. Because part of that is the operational aspect. Well, sure, you kind of know availability groups, but because it's just you, any other person who doesn't really know anything about AGs yet, and you're going to support this 24/7. So who's responsible it is to figure out the availability group aspect versus figuring out the pacemaker aspect? Whose responsibility is it when you're now in production and you need 24/7 support? That was more than enough reason for them to put that in the back burner. Even when SQL Server 2019 was released, they still did not implement always on available groups on Linux, again, because of those two main concerns. So they decided, okay, we'll just deploy it on a Windows Server failover cluster. And sure enough, they have people who are responsible for the operations, the maintenance, and taking care of it, in, as well as when there's some issues going on. This is, again, something that a lot of consultants and people who are introducing a technology are almost immediately jumping into. Let's talk about the features. Let's talk about the benefits. The latest and the greatest is not always the best, right? The latest and the greatest is not always the best. I've had clients and customers who I've recommended technology, I've recommended the latest and the greatest, because the latest and the greatest and technology is their competitive advantage. I've had a client way back when clustered column store indexes were introduced in SQL Server 2014, I believe, and operational analytics. They took advantage of that. And they migrated from SQL Server 2008 to SQL Server 2014 because that's their competitive advantage. They wanted to introduce additional offerings to their clients, and this is the way to do it, right? Well, a more cost-effective way to do it, because they could do it with Oracle, but SQL Server is a lot better. Uh, that was their competitive advantage. And so I was like, sure, let's use the technology to give you the competitive advantage. Let's not just use the features for using the feature as it is. Let's turn it into your competitive advantage, right? And I only recommend upgrading to the latest and the greatest for two things. Number one, you're completely out of support, so you need to upgrade, right? Or two, you are definitely going to benefit from taking advantage of the latest and greatest feature, right? I get no commissions from recommending upgrading to the latest and the greatest versions of Windows or SQL Server. I wish I had like commissions from selling Microsoft licenses, because that's a license in and of itself. I don't get any kickbacks out of recommending Microsoft licenses whenever an upgrade needs to be done. But I recommend an upgrade because, number one, customers are no longer officially supported. Like, they're still on SQL Server 2005. You got to get away from that, or 2008. Got to get away from that because it's no longer officially supported. And I also understand that there are reasons why you cannot just upgrade. Like, for instance, it's a regulatory recommendation where you have to be certified for that version, and it requires rigorous process just to get certified. Well, there's no benefit for them to just upgrade for the sake of it, so they'll just take the risk of not being officially supported, so long as they're regulatory, they're compliant as far as regulations are concerned, right? So these are three things that most SQL Server consultants and experts who are coming in and providing the solution to you, they're not telling you about. Not because they want to hide something from you. No, it's because, again, most of the time they're not even aware of it. They're not aware of the fact that this solution is so complex that if I hand it over to the operations team or the internal team, they won't be able to manage it, right? They're not aware of that because, again, having done this multiple times, for them it's simple. They're the way I look at it, a college student's math, simple math, is not a 5-year-old's version of simple math. Totally different. But because the college student has already been doing this for years, for him it's simple, right? And so most of the consultants don't recognize that because they've been doing it so long. They've been doing it for so many times that for them it's simple. Whereas in your case, well, I don't even know what failover cluster is. I don't even know what availability groups is. I don't even know what log shipping is, or database, or how all of these HA and DR solution. So I'm confused, right? For them it's normal. For you it's just mind blowing, right? They don't recognize that. They don't recognize the billable hours because everybody, even employees, have that way of thinking when it comes to doing the work. Well, I'm getting paid regardless of whether I do the work fast or slow. Doesn't matter. So billable hours, go figure, right? And the third one is that the latest and the greatest is not always the best solution, right? The best solution is the one that achieves your goals and helps you achieve the outcomes and the results that your company needs, right? That is about it for this week's Practical SQL Server HADR show. Tune in again next week. And if your company, your team needs help on trying to just evaluate, do we really need a high availability solution at the moment? Or DR is a thing. What do you think you need it or not? It really is something that you need to have. Like, DR is one thing, but HA sometimes, well, it depends on what the business needs are. Let me know. Use that link on the screen. Schedule a strategy call. We are going to evaluate your infrastructure and your business needs to understand whether or not you really need it. And if you do, I'm more than happy to help in any way I can. If not, I'll steer you to the direction that would help you achieve your internal company's goals as far as high availability and disaster recovery solutions are concerned. All right. That is about it for this week's episode. Tune in again next week for another topic of conversation. And if you've had experiences working with external consultants where you've seen these 3 things that I've shared with you. Type it in the comments section. Share your story. I'd love to hear from you. Right? Enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your weekend. Friday is technically a weekend for me, and enjoy the rest of whatever it is that you do for fun. Enjoy while it's beautiful outside. Goodbye.